still remember the exact color of the carpet in the lawyer's office. Burgundy, but dulled by years of shoes and secrets. The air was thick with that lemony furniture polish smell, too bright for a day like this. I was holding my breath, I think, even before I sat down. Widowhood, I'd learned, doesn't come with instructions. It's just 1,000 tiny humiliations, like not knowing where to put your hands while everyone else stares at you with watery sympathy. My husband's death was sudden, the kind that leaves your brain lagging behind your body. One minute you're boiling water for tea, the next, there's a call from an unfamiliar number, a voice trembling as it says, "Are you Mrs. Harrison? There's been an accident?" That word, accident, as if a life can be reduced to a traffic report. The days after blurred together, casseroles left on the porch, my daughter's arms around me, the hush that fell whenever I entered a room. But I kept thinking, at least I have the memories. At least I was his wife. The will reading was supposed to be a formality. I wasn't expecting surprises. But as soon as I walked into that stuffy office, I felt something shift. The lawyer, Mr. Brandt, looked at me with a tight smile, his eyes darting past me. 2 men in suits sat against the wall. My husband's business partners, I guessed. But it was the woman in the corner that caught my attention. She was about my age, maybe a little older, with a face that looked like it had weathered too many storms. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. You're watching Women Unwritten. Tap like and subscribe so more voices get heard. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is not just a story, it's a reckoning. Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Mr. Brandt cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. I know this is a difficult time. His voice was too rehearsed, like he'd said these words 100 times. He opened a leather folder and pulled out a sheaf of papers. We are here to execute the last will and testament of Richard Harrison. I sat up straighter. My name, on legal paper, felt suddenly fragile. He started reading. The usual, debts to be paid, charitable donations, a few mementos for old friends. Then, to my beloved wife. He paused, looked up, and then looked away. That was when the woman in the corner stood up. Her chair scraped the carpet, loud and jarring. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm sorry, but I am Richard's wife." It was like the air in the room had been sucked out. I stared at her, not understanding. The lawyer's face went pale. One of the businessmen muttered something under his breath. I felt the beginnings of panic rising in my chest. "No," I managed to say. I'm his wife. I've been married to Richard for 22 years. She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. I married him in Nevada, 1995. I have the certificate. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it out with shaking hands. Mr. Brandt looked as if he might faint. He took the document, his lips moving silently as he read. Then he looked at me, his eyes softening with something like pity. There appears to be a legal complication, he said, voice brittle. Mrs. Harrison, perhaps we should speak in private. But the other woman wouldn't sit down. He never divorced me, she said, voice cracking. I tried to find him. I tried. Her words hit me like cold water. I wanted to scream, to stand up and demand she leave, but my body wouldn't move. I just sat there, numb, as the lawyer gathered the papers and excused everyone but the two of us. When the room was empty, Mr. Brandt closed the door quietly. He looked at me as if I were made of glass. I'm so sorry, Elaine, he said gently. I had no idea. I only learned of this woman yesterday, when she called the office. I swallowed, my throat burning. What does this mean? Am I not his wife? Is my marriage, what, nothing? He hesitated, glancing at the woman, whose name I still didn't know. Legally, if Mr. Harrison was still married to Ms. Sanders, he nodded toward her, then your marriage may not be valid. I'll need to investigate. I felt the ground tilting beneath me. 22 years, birthdays, anniversaries, the house we'd built together, our daughter. Was that all a lie? I looked at her, this stranger, and saw the same devastation mirrored in her face. I didn't know, she whispered, voice breaking. I swear, I thought he'd left me. I never remarried. I tried to move on, but I always wondered. Something inside me crumpled. I wanted to hate her, but I saw her hands trembling, the grief etched in her lines. In that moment, we were both women undone by the same man. Mr. Brandt handed me an envelope. "Richard left this for you," he said softly. "He asked me to give it to you at the reading." My hands shook as I took it. The weight of it was heavier than I expected. I opened it right there, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the paper tear. Inside was a single sheet, handwritten in my husband's familiar scrawl. "I'm sorry, Elaine. There are things I never told you. Please forgive me. I never meant to hurt you. No explanations, no details. Just that. Just a coward's apology." I pressed the note to my chest and tried not to sob. The lawyer said something else. Legal steps, next actions. But I barely heard him. My whole life felt suddenly unstable, every memory I had with Richard wobbling on a cracked foundation. When I finally stood to leave, the other woman touched my arm, gentle as a ghost. "If you want to talk," she said quietly. "I'm staying at the Holiday Inn off Main." I couldn't answer. I just walked out, feeling the eyes of the receptionist burning holes in my back. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the note, the will, and the marriage certificate she'd left behind. My daughter, Olivia, called from college, her voice bright and oblivious. "How did it go, Mom? Did Dad leave you something funny, like his old fishing hat?" I almost told her everything right then, but I couldn't, not yet. How do you tell your child that her whole existence might be a legal fiction? That the man who tucked her in at night might not have been who he said he was? Instead, I lied. "It was fine, sweetheart. Just paperwork. I'm tired, that's all." When I hung up, I sat there in the dark, listening to the tick of the kitchen clock. I thought about calling the other woman, about screaming at her, blaming her, begging her for answers. But I knew she didn't have them. The only person who could explain was gone. In the days that followed, I became a detective in my own life. I searched through Richard's files, bank statements, old photo albums. I found things that didn't add up, receipts from cities he'd never mentioned, a set of keys to an apartment I'd never seen, a lockbox I didn't have the code for. I kept replaying the past, hunting for clues. Had he ever slipped? Had he ever tried to tell me? There were moments, now that I thought about it, when he'd grown distant, when he'd stared out the window just a little too long. I began to wonder, did I ever really know the man I married? Or had I loved an invention, a shadow? Everywhere I went, I saw reminders of him. The coffee mug with the chip in the rim, his old slippers by the door. I couldn't bring myself to move them. It felt like erasing what little I had left. My friends tried to help. Some brought food, others offered empty reassurances. He loved you, that's what matters. But I wanted the truth, not comfort. One afternoon, as I sat sorting through Richard's papers, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I'm sorry for what you're going through. Please meet me. I can explain." It was signed, M. Sanders. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the reply button. Did I want more pain, or did I want answers? In the end, curiosity won. I agreed to meet her the next morning at a little coffee shop downtown. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with questions. Who was she really? What did she know about my husband? Our husband? The next day, I arrived early, my stomach in knots. She was already there, staring into her coffee. When she saw me, she stood, awkward and unsure. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. I sat across from her, folding my hands in my lap to hide the tremor. You said you could explain, so explain. She took a shaky breath. I met Richard in 1995. We were both young, stupid. We eloped in Reno. He was charming, funny, a little reckless. But after a year, he changed. He said he needed space, that he had to travel for work. Then he just stopped coming home. No calls, no letters. I looked for him, but it was like he vanished. I always wondered if something happened. I never remarried. I just tried to move on. I listened, heart pounding, as she described a man I almost recognized, but not quite. Was it possible he'd led 2 separate lives, 2 separate loves? She pulled a photo from her purse, the 2 of them, young and sunburned, smiling on a boat. My husband looked the same, but also different. Lighter, somehow. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never wanted any of this. I never knew he'd started a new life. I believed her. In her eyes, I saw the same bewilderment that haunted me. We sat in silence, 2 women mourning the same ghost. Before we parted, she squeezed my hand. He must have loved you. I hope you find peace. I walked home in a fog, the city blurring around me. My whole world had been upended, but somewhere in the mess of it all, I felt a strange kinship with her. We'd both been betrayed, both left to pick up the pieces. That night, I stared at Richard's note again. I'm sorry, Elaine. There are things I never told you. Please forgive me. I wondered if forgiveness was even possible. I spent the next week drifting through my own life as if I were visiting someone else's house. Everything familiar had been shifted somehow. Even my own reflection looked a little foreign. I kept thinking about the woman from the will reading, Margaret Sanders, I now knew her name, and how her story overlapped with mine, threads woven through decades without either of us knowing. I replayed her words, her voice quivering with something that was part grief, part exhaustion. There were practical things I had to deal with, of course. Bank accounts, credit cards, the endless bureaucracy of death. But every time I heard myself say, my husband, I wondered if I had the right. Was I still a wife, or had I always just been an imposter in someone else's story? I tried to hide all this from Olivia. She was busy with finals, calling every night to check in. I didn't want to burden her with questions about her own legitimacy, about the cracks in our family. Still, I sensed she knew something was wrong. She'd ask, Are you sleeping, Mom? Or, Have you eaten today? With a seriousness I hadn't heard before. The loneliness was overwhelming. At night, I'd lie awake and listen to the sound of the house settling, the way I used to when Richard was away on business trips. But now, every creak, every sigh in the wood reminded me that I was utterly, completely alone. I'd reach for the empty space beside me, half expecting to find him there, and then remember. Gone, and not just to death. One afternoon, while sorting through Richard's old files in the basement, I found a box I didn't recognize. It was tucked behind a stack of tax returns, taped shut with a strip of faded masking tape. My hands shook as I peeled it open. Inside were bundles of letters, some yellowed with age, all addressed in Richard's blocky handwriting. Most were addressed to M. Sanders. I didn't know whether to feel angry, curious, or just tired. I sat on the cold basement floor and started reading. The letters spanned years, apologies, explanations, promises to return. Some of them sounded desperate, others were almost clinical, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. There was one that stopped me cold. It was dated just a year before he died. Margaret, I can't undo the past. I know I owe you more than words, but all I have left is regret. I tried to build something good with Elaine, but that doesn't erase the harm I caused you. I hope you can forgive me someday. He'd signed it, simply, Richard. I realized then that I wasn't the only one living with his secrets. I wondered what else I didn't know, how many apologies he'd written in the dark, how many truths he'd hidden from me. My anger flared, hot and brief. How could he do this? How could he leave us both stranded, neither of us with answers? I wanted to scream, to smash something, but all I managed was a shuddering sob. Later that day, I called my sister, Carol. She was always the practical one, the fixer. I told her everything, or almost everything. I left out the rawest parts, the moments I felt most ashamed. She listened quietly, then said, "He lied to both of you. Don't make this your fault, Elaine. You did nothing wrong." I wanted to believe her, but shame is a stubborn thing. It clings to you, seeps into your bones. A few days later, I got a call from Mr. Brandt. His voice was as careful as ever. "Elaine, I wanted to update you. Legally, things are complicated, but there's a way forward. We'll need to petition the court for a determination of marriage. It may be possible to establish you as a putative spouse, given you acted in good faith." The words sounded cold, legalistic. Putative spouse. As if I were only pretending. He continued, "There may be a hearing. Margaret has already indicated she won't contest your claim. She just wants closure." Closure. As if that was something you could file away, like a tax form. I thanked him, barely listening. All I could think about was sitting in a courtroom, strangers listening as my life was dissected, my marriage reduced to technicalities. A week passed. Margaret texted me one evening. "I hope you're okay. If you ever want to talk or just yell, I'll listen." I stared at her message for a long time before replying. "I'm not okay, but thank you. I might take you up on that." I wasn't sure why, but I found myself needing her. Not because I forgave Richard, or even because I understood her pain, but because she was the only other person who knew the shape of this wound. We met again, this time at a quiet park on the edge of town. We walked, slowly, saying little. She told me about her life after Richard, how she'd tried dating again, but nothing ever felt right. She asked about Olivia, about how I'd met him. I told her stories I'd never told anyone else. How Richard proposed in the rain, how he'd made me laugh until I cried, how he'd always remembered my birthday, but never remembered to take out the trash. We shared memories, each of us holding a corner of a life that was bigger than either of us alone. As we sat on a bench, she turned to me, her eyes shining. "I keep thinking, what if he'd just told the truth? Maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe we'd both have been free." I nodded, wiping away tears. He kept us both prisoners, didn't he? Even now, after he's gone. For the first time since the will reading, I felt something like relief. The truth hurt, but at least it was solid. At least I could build on it. The court date arrived quickly. I wore a navy dress, one Richard had always liked. My hands shook as I entered the courthouse, but I held my head high. Margaret sat behind me, her presence a quiet comfort. The hearing was brief, clinical. Mr. Brandt spoke on my behalf, outlining my years with Richard, our daughter, our home. Margaret testified too, her voice steady. "I never knew he'd remarried. I only found out after his death. I don't want anything from Elaine. I just want the truth." When the judge rendered his decision, it felt anticlimactic. Given the facts, the court recognizes Elaine Harrison as a putative spouse and awards her the rights and property due to her under the law. People tell you that justice is satisfying, that it brings closure. But standing there, clutching a stack of legal papers, I felt only exhaustion. The law had recognized me, but the ache in my chest remained. I went home, changed out of the navy dress, and sat in the backyard until the stars came out. I thought about all the ways my life could have been different. If Richard had told the truth, if Margaret had found him, if I'd asked more questions, looked harder at the oddities. But I also thought about the woman I was now, a woman who had survived betrayal, who had faced the truth, who had chosen to keep living, even when the ground gave way beneath her. Olivia came home from college for the weekend. She hugged me at the door, tighter than usual. I decided it was time to tell her. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I'd read Richard's note. I told her everything about Margaret, the will, the truth about our marriage. She listened, silent, her eyes growing wide. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "He was still my dad," she said quietly. "And you're still my mom. That doesn't change." Her words were balm, softening something hard inside me. Over the next weeks, I started putting my life back together. I cleaned out Richard's closet, donated his clothes, boxed up his papers. I found more letters, more fragments of the life he'd led before me. But I stopped searching for meaning in them. Some things would always remain unfinished. Margaret and I kept in touch. We became unlikely friends, bound by the peculiar intimacy of shared loss. Sometimes we'd joke about Richard's terrible taste in neckties, or his stubborn refusal to ask for directions. Other times, we'd sit in silence, letting the past drift away. I started going to a grief group at the community center. At first, I just listened. But eventually, I spoke. I told my story, careful to leave out the messiest parts, but honest about the hurt. Other women nodded, understanding in their eyes. Grief, I learned, isn't about who you were to the person who's gone. It's about what you're left holding when the world shifts. One evening, after group, a woman named Harriet stopped me. "You're stronger than you think," she said. "It takes courage to keep loving, even when your heart's been broken." I thought about that as I drove home. Maybe I was stronger than I knew. As spring came, I found myself looking forward again. I planted tulips in the garden, read books just for pleasure, called old friends. I let myself laugh, sometimes, even when it hurt. One afternoon, Margaret called. "Do you want to get coffee?" she asked, her voice lighter than I'd ever heard it. "We met at the same cafe?" "As before." She was smiling, genuinely smiling. "I think I'm finally ready to move on," she said. "I'm selling my house, traveling a bit, starting over." I smiled back, surprised by how happy I felt for her. "You deserve it," I said. "We both do." As I drove home, I realized I did too. Maybe I'd never have all the answers. Maybe the past would always ache, just a little. But I was still here, still living, still capable of love. That night, as I climbed into bed, I felt the empty space beside me, but it didn't hurt as much. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dark. "I forgive you, Richard, for what you did, for what you couldn't say. I forgive you, and I'm letting go." For the first time in months, I slept without dreams. Morning sunlight spilled across my kitchen table, and for the first time in a long while, I let it warm my face without flinching. The air felt different that day, crisp, expectant, like the world was quietly nudging me forward. I made myself a real breakfast, not just toast or coffee, and found myself humming a song I hadn't thought about in years. There was a lightness inside me, tentative but real, as if some deep ache had finally begun to ease. But grief doesn't let go all at once. It comes back in unexpected ways. When I opened the mailbox that afternoon, there was a letter from the bank addressed to the estate of Richard Harrison. My hands trembled a little as I carried it inside. I set it on the counter, meaning to ignore it, but the old habit of responsibility kicked in. I sat down, took a breath, and opened it. Inside, there was a notification about a safe deposit box Richard had kept at a downtown branch. For years, he'd mentioned it in passing, usually with a shrug and a joke about man things I wouldn't find interesting. He'd never offered me a key. Now, apparently, it was mine to deal with. I called the bank, explained the situation, and they told me to bring ID and the estate papers. Their tone was brisk and impersonal, as if I were just another widow closing accounts. I hung up, and for a moment, I felt the familiar sting of being reduced to paperwork. But curiosity got the better of me. What had Richard kept locked away all these years? More secrets? More apologies? The bank branch was cold and sterile, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The manager, a young woman with a practiced smile, led me to a back room and slid a small metal box across the table. She stepped out, leaving me alone with it. My fingers hesitated over the lock, but the key fit easily. The box creaked open. Inside was an odd assortment: an old wristwatch I'd never seen before, a bundle of faded photographs, and a thick envelope. The watch was heavy and masculine, nothing like the one Richard wore every day. I turned it over and found initials engraved on the back: CAS. I didn't recognize them. The photographs were even more puzzling. Some were of Richard, younger, standing with a tall man whose face was familiar but just out of reach. Other pictures showed a little boy, maybe 5 or 6, grinning with a missing front tooth. The boy looked enough like Richard to be his son, or maybe his brother. I stared at the photos, searching for clues, but there were no names, no dates. I opened the envelope, half expecting another apology. Instead, there was a sheaf of legal documents, adoption papers, dated decades ago, from a small town in Illinois. The names jumped out at me: Richard Allen Harrison, adopted by Charles and Annette Sanders. My heart stuttered. Sanders. Margaret's last name. I sat back, stunned. I'd never known Richard was adopted. He'd never mentioned any of this, not once in 22 years. I wondered if Margaret knew. I wondered how many versions of himself Richard had tucked away, locked behind doors he never let anyone open. Back home, I spread the contents of the box on my dining table. The pieces didn't fit together. Why keep this a secret? Why never mention his childhood, his adoptive parents? My mind spun with questions I knew would never be answered. I called Margaret that evening, the box still open in front of me. She sounded surprised to hear from me, but listened quietly as I explained what I'd found. "I knew he was adopted," she said softly. "But he never talked about it. He was always running from something, Elaine. Even with me. Maybe that's why he was never able to settle, really settle, with anyone." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to argue, to defend the man I'd loved, but I couldn't. I realized, with a sharp pang, that I didn't know the full story. Maybe I never had. Later, as I tidied the table, I found myself holding the photograph of the little boy, staring at his bright, hopeful smile. I wondered what he'd wanted from life, what promises he'd made to himself before adulthood wore him down. That night, I dreamed of Richard as a boy, running through a field, laughing. But when he turned to face me, his eyes were shadowed, unknowable. The next morning, Olivia called. She was coming home for a long weekend and wanted to bring her new boyfriend, Mark. I was nervous, not about meeting Mark, but about how much of the truth I owed my daughter. I didn't want her to feel betrayed by her own father, but I also didn't want to keep lying by omission. They arrived late Friday afternoon, arms full of groceries and flowers. Olivia was radiant, her cheeks flushed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Mark was tall, soft-spoken, immediately helpful. The three of us cooked dinner together, and for a few hours, it almost felt normal. After Mark went outside to take a call, Olivia turned to me, her expression serious. "Mom, is everything really okay? You've seemed different, not just sad, like you're holding something back." I sat down, steeling myself. "There's more to what happened with your father. Things I didn't know until after he died. About his past, about another marriage before me, about secrets he kept." She listened, silent and wide-eyed, as I told her the whole story. Margaret, the will, the letters, the safe deposit box. I showed her the photos, the adoption papers. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she reached out and squeezed my hand. "He was complicated, I guess. But he loved us. I know that. You don't have to protect me, Mom." Her words brought a lump to my throat. For so long, I'd been trying to shield her from pain, but maybe she was stronger than I realized. We sat together on the couch, flipping through the old photos, trying to make sense of the fragments. Olivia wondered aloud if the little boy in the pictures was her father or someone else. We speculated, laughed at Richard's terrible 70s haircut, remembered the good things. That weekend, I watched my daughter step into adulthood in front of my eyes. She comforted me, teased me, made me feel less alone. She and Mark cooked breakfast, fixed the leaky faucet, filled the house with laughter. As they left on Sunday, Olivia hugged me tight. "Let's not let the past ruin what we have, okay? We're still a family. We get to decide what that means now." Her words echoed in my mind for days. I started thinking about what kind of life I wanted, who I wanted to be, now that the old roles had been stripped away. I began to spend more time outside, walking in the neighborhood, reacquainting myself with the world. Neighbors stopped me to offer condolences, to share stories about Richard. Most were kind, some awkward. A few hinted that they'd known he was complicated, though no one seemed to know the full truth. One evening, as I walked past the old Sanders house, the address from the adoption papers, I saw a woman tending the garden. I hesitated, then introduced myself. Her name was Annette, Richard's adoptive mother. She was old now, her hair white and thin, but her eyes were sharp. When I told her who I was, she invited me in for tea. We sat in her tidy living room, surrounded by faded photographs and mementos. She told me stories of Richard as a boy, his stubbornness, his quick wit, his need to run. "He was always searching for something," she said, her gaze distant. "I loved him, but he never let anyone close for long. I'm sorry for what you've been through." I left her house with a sense of closure, or at least understanding. Richard had been many things: a husband, a father, a son, a runaway. His secrets weren't about us, not really. They were about him, about wounds that went too deep for words. As the weeks passed, I found myself letting go of the need to know everything. Some questions would remain unanswered, some hurts never fully explained. But I could choose what to carry forward, what to release. Margaret called one afternoon, breathless and excited. She'd sold her house and booked a trip to Italy. "I'm finally doing something just for me," she said. "Thank you for being my friend, Elaine. I don't think I could have made it through without you." I smiled, genuinely happy for her. "Send me a postcard," I said. "Promise?" She laughed. "I promise." That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the porch, watching the sky turn gold and then deep blue. I felt the ache of loss, but also the possibility of something new. I wasn't just Richard's wife or the woman left behind. I was Elaine, and my story was still unfolding. I closed my eyes and listened to the quiet, letting it fill me. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what I might hear. The summer air hung heavy and fragrant, sweet with cut grass and wild honeysuckle. I started to notice small joys again: a neighbor's dog napping in a sunbeam, the taste of fresh peaches, the gentle hush of the evenings. Grief still surprised me, sometimes crashing over me for no reason, but the edges were softer now. I'd wake in the middle of the night expecting to hear Richard's breathing, and instead of panic, feel only a kind of wistful nostalgia. One afternoon, while sorting through the last of Richard's things in the attic, I stumbled on a battered briefcase wedged behind an old trunk. Its leather was cracked, the clasp stubborn. Inside, among the usual jumble of old receipts and business cards, was a slim notebook I'd never seen before. The cover was navy blue, faded at the corners. For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to throw it away, pretend I hadn't found it. But another part, braver, or maybe just more desperate for understanding, opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably Richard's. The pages were filled with lists, half-finished sketches, and scattered thoughts. Some entries were nothing more than a date and a line. "Saw Olivia's first steps today?" She laughed. Others were dense and restless, words scratched out and rewritten, fragments of confessions, apologies he'd never spoken aloud. One entry, in particular, caught my eye. It was dated years before he died, And the words were raw. I keep waiting to be found out, to be forgiven for things I can't explain. I love Elaine. I love Olivia. I want to be a better man, but I'm always running from the shadows behind me. I'm sorry I can't say any of this out loud. I read the page over and over, my heart twisting. The anger I'd felt for months began to give way to something else. Pity, maybe, or just a weary compassion. He'd been haunted, not by us, but by something older, something he'd never learned to name. I closed the notebook and pressed it to my chest, letting my tears come quietly, grateful that Olivia was out for the evening and wouldn't see her mother breaking all over again. Later, when I'd collected myself, I called Olivia. I told her I'd found something of her father's, something that made me think he'd loved us more than he'd ever been able to show. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's enough for me, Mom. I think it's enough." In the following days, I decided to pack up the attic for good. I made neat boxes for Charity, for Olivia, for memories I couldn't part with. I found things that made me laugh, a pair of ridiculous sunglasses, a postcard from a disastrous camping trip, a trophy from a company softball game where Richard had pulled his hamstring trying to impress Olivia. Each memory hurt, but in a sweet way, like pressing a bruise to remind yourself it's healing. Carol came to help one weekend, her arms full of Tupperware and good intentions. We worked together in comfortable silence, occasionally stopping to reminisce or gossip about our childhood. She told me I was doing better than she expected, that she was proud of me. I didn't know how to tell her that some days, just getting out of bed felt like an accomplishment. As the attic emptied, so did some of the heaviness inside me. I realized I was ready, maybe not to move on exactly, but to move forward. That night, after Carol left, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and Margaret's latest postcard propped in front of me. It showed a sunlit piazza in Florence, pigeons swirling around ancient stone. Her message was brief. "Wish you were here. Gelato is overrated. Freedom isn't." I smiled, genuinely happy for her. I thought about writing back, but instead, I found myself writing a letter to Richard, not to send, just to say what needed saying. "Richard, I wish you'd trusted me with your truth. I wish you'd believed I could love all of you, not just the parts you wanted me to see. But I forgive you. I forgive you for leaving me with questions, for the mess, for the pain. I hope wherever you are, you're finally at peace. I'm learning to be too." I folded the letter and tucked it into the blue notebook, placing both in a box of keepsakes for Olivia. Someday, when she's ready, she can read it. Or not. Either way, it's hers. In the weeks that followed, I found myself saying yes to things I'd put off for years. I joined a local book club, started volunteering at the library, even took a watercolor class. I was terrible at painting, but it made me laugh, and that was reason enough to keep going. One Saturday, after a particularly chaotic painting session, I met a woman named Nina. She was about my age, quick-witted and kind, with a laugh that filled the room. We bonded over our mutual lack of artistic talent, and soon found ourselves sharing stories over coffee. She told me about her own losses, a husband gone to cancer, a son who lived far away. There was a quiet understanding between us, a recognition of the scars we carried. We started meeting regularly, sometimes just to walk by the river or sit in the park and watch the world go by. I told her about Richard, about Margaret, about the mess he'd left behind. She listened without judgment, nodding in all the right places, her own story woven quietly through mine. Nina encouraged me to start writing again. I'd always loved words, but somewhere along the way, I'd stopped believing I had anything worth saying. With her gentle prodding, I began keeping a journal, scribbling down memories, thoughts, and the slow, awkward process of putting myself back together. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees and the air grew cool, Nina asked, "Do you ever think you'll want to date again?" The question startled me. I laughed, a little too loudly, but then shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe. I'm not sure I even know how." She smiled. You don't have to know. Just be open to whatever comes. Sometimes, that's enough. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the future, not in terms of what I'd lost, but what I might still find. I let myself imagine new beginnings, small joys, even love, in whatever form it might take. Olivia called the next day, bubbling with excitement about a summer internship she'd landed in New York. I felt a surge of pride and a pang of loneliness. My little girl was growing up, carving out her own place in the world. I promised to visit her, and for the first time, I actually meant it. As the summer wound down, I noticed the world shifting around me. The air was cooler in the mornings, leaves already tinged with gold at the edges. I found myself looking forward to autumn, the promise of change, the comfort of sweaters and warm soup, the slow unfolding of another year. One afternoon, as I walked home from the library, I passed the old Sanders house again. Annette was out front, waving to me. I stopped to chat, and she invited me in for tea. We talked about Richard, her memories blending with mine, filling in gaps I hadn't even known were there. He was a difficult child, she said, her voice soft. But he loved fiercely. He just didn't know how to stay. I thought about that for a long time after I left. About loving fiercely, about not knowing how to stay, about the patterns we inherit, the ones we pass on if we're not careful. That evening, as I watered the garden, I noticed a single tulip blooming late, its petals stubborn against the chill. I smiled, tracing its stem with my finger, and felt something shift inside me. Gratitude, maybe, or just the quiet certainty that I was still here, still growing, even after everything. I went inside, made myself a simple dinner, and sat by the window with a book. For the first time in ages, I felt not just like a survivor, but like a woman with a future. A woman unwritten, yes, but also, finally, a woman unafraid. There was something about the way the seasons changed that year that made every ordinary moment feel newly significant. I found myself paying attention to things I'd once rushed past. The way sunlight flickered through the kitchen curtains, the chorus of crickets at dusk, the scent of rain on hot pavement. Sometimes grief sharpens your senses, as if your mind is reminding you that you're still here, still capable of wonder, even after loss. With Olivia in New York for her internship, the house grew quieter. Too quiet, at times. I'd wake up to silence and have to remind myself I was alone by choice, not by accident. I filled the emptiness with routines: morning walks, afternoons at the library, evenings with Nina or the book club. I learned how to be alone without being lonely, though it took practice. One afternoon, while tidying the living room, I found the old family photo albums tucked behind a stack of cookbooks. I sat cross-legged on the floor, paging through them. There was Richard, caught mid-laugh at Olivia's 5th birthday, flour on his nose from a disastrous attempt at baking. There was our first house, the wallpaper hideous, but the garden beautiful. There was even a snapshot of Margaret, standing just outside the frame at a company picnic. I hadn't noticed her before, but there she was, her eyes flickering toward Richard in a way that now made me pause. I wondered if she had recognized me, back then, as someone on the edge of her own story. How many times had our lives brushed up against each other without us knowing? After that, I called Margaret again. She was back from Italy, her voice lighter, her laughter easier. We met for coffee at a new cafe, this time as friends, not rivals. She showed me pictures from her trip, sun-drenched hills, a glass of wine held up against a pink sky, her own smile unguarded for the first time in years. We talked about Richard, about forgiveness, about the strange bond that had grown between us. She told me she was seeing someone new, a gentle man named Luca she'd met on a train. I felt a complicated tangle of emotions: happiness for her, envy of her courage, a pang of longing for something I hadn't let myself want. As we parted, she squeezed my hand. "You know, Elaine, we're more than what he left behind. We get to write our own endings now." Those words lingered. That night, I dug out my journal and wrote them down. I realized I had started to believe them. Autumn settled in, golden and brisk. I painted my bedroom, rearranged the furniture, donated boxes of things I no longer needed. Each small act of change felt like a declaration. I was choosing my life, not just inheriting it. Nina and I kept up our ritual walks by the river. One afternoon, as we watched the water eddy around a cluster of rocks, she turned to me, her eyes thoughtful. "Have you thought about dating?" she asked, her tone gentle. I hesitated. I'd thought about it, in the abstract, but the idea of inviting someone new into my life felt daunting. Too vulnerable, too soon, maybe too much. But Nina just smiled, as if she understood. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But don't close the door before you know what's on the other side." That evening, I sat on my porch and watched the sky fade from orange to deep indigo. I realized I wanted to feel seen again, wanted to share stories and laughter, to be more than the sum of my grief. So I took a breath and signed up for an online dating site, something I'd once sworn I'd never do. The process was awkward, almost comical at times. I wrote and rewrote my profile, trying to strike a balance between honesty and hope. I uploaded a recent photo, choosing one where I looked a little windswept but undeniably happy. The messages trickled in, some kind, some awkward, some instantly forgettable. I went on a few coffee dates, safe, daylight meetings where the stakes were low. Most were polite, a little stilted, like two actors reading from different scripts. But it felt good somehow, to be seen as a woman again, not just a widow. One man, David, was different. He was a retired teacher, gentle and curious, with a dry sense of humor. We met for coffee, then lunch, then walks in the park. Our conversations were easy, meandering from books to childhood memories to the small absurdities of daily life. He asked about Richard, about Margaret, about the tangled knot of my past. I told him the truth, not all at once, but in pieces, as I felt ready. He listened, never judging, never pressing. He shared his own losses, the wife he'd loved and lost to illness, the way he'd learned to let go without forgetting. One evening, as we sat on a bench overlooking the river, David reached for my hand. His touch was warm, steady. "You're allowed to be happy again," he said softly. "You're allowed to want more." His words undid something inside me. I let myself lean into him, just a little, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel guilty for wanting comfort. I told Olivia about David during one of our weekly calls. She was quiet at first, then said, "I'm glad, Mom. You deserve someone who sees you." Her blessing meant more than I could express. As the weeks passed, my life filled with small, new rituals: coffee with David, book club discussions that ran late into the evening, text messages from Margaret with tales of her adventures. I realized I was building something, not just rebuilding. On a crisp October day, Olivia came home for a weekend visit. We walked through the farmer's market, bought apples and cinnamon donuts, and laughed until our sides hurt. She asked about David, about my new friends, about the changes in the house. I could see her watching me, measuring the ways I was different, and the ways I was still her mother. That night, she hugged me hard before bed. "I'm proud of you, Mom. You're braver than you think." After she left, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, studying my own face. I saw the lines, the gray at my temples, but also a kind of brightness that surprised me. I traced the curve of my smile, realizing it had returned, quietly, when I wasn't looking. It occurred to me then that I'd spent so much of my life waiting for Richard to come home, for Olivia to grow up, for the pain to subside. Now, for the first time, I was choosing to forgive, to hope, to risk. Nina called me late one night, her voice giddy. She'd signed up for a pottery class, and her first attempt had collapsed spectacularly on the wheel. We laughed until tears streamed down my face. I told her about my own misadventures in dating, the disasters and the small triumphs. We promised to keep daring each other, to keep saying yes. As winter approached, I felt the world slowing down. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. But inside, I felt steady, unafraid of the darkness. There would always be things I didn't understand. About Richard, about the choices he'd made, about the secrets he'd kept. But I was no longer trapped by them. I went to sleep that night with the window cracked open, the cold air sharp and bracing. I let myself dream, not of the past, but of what still waited for me. And when I woke, I found that I was ready, finally, to write the next chapter of my life. The first snow arrived early that year, soft and tentative, dusting the world in quiet white. I woke to see the yard blanketed, every sharp edge softened, the garden beds tucked in under their winter quilt. I stood at the window with my coffee, watching the flakes drift down, and felt something inside me settle. Grief, I realized, could be gentle too, a hush instead of a storm. David called that morning, his voice bright and warm. "Come outside," he said. "I want to show you something." I laughed, pulling on boots and mittens, suddenly feeling 10 years younger as I bundled up. He was waiting in his old sedan, engine running, a thermos of cocoa between us as we drove to the park. The world was nearly empty, branches outlined in lace, the playground silent except for our footsteps crunching in the snow. We walked without hurry, talking about nothing and everything. He told me about his childhood winters, building snow forts with his brothers, the time he'd fallen through the ice and been hauled out, shivering and embarrassed, by his father. I shared my own memories, Olivia's first snow angel, Richard's lopsided snowmen, the way the house always smelled of cinnamon and wet wool in December. At one point, David stopped and brushed snow from a bench. "You're different lately," he said, his eyes kind. Lighter, not lost, just changed. I knew what he meant. I felt it too, this new lightness, like I'd finally set down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. We sat together, sharing the cocoa, and I realized how grateful I was to have found a companion for this part of the journey. Not someone to fill the space Richard had left, but someone to walk beside me in the life I was making now. Later that week, I decorated the house for the holidays. I hesitated over the old ornaments, each one a small memory. Olivia's preschool snowman, Richard's favorite red ball, a paper angel that had survived more years than I cared to count. For a moment, I considered leaving them boxed away, afraid that unwrapping them would unwrap old wounds. But instead, I hung them one by one, letting the memories come and go like music, bittersweet, but welcome. Carol visited, bringing her famous gingerbread and that relentless energy of hers. She insisted on a tree, so we drove to the lot together, tromping through rows of pine until we found the one that looked like it had survived something, as Carol put it. We laughed, breath visible in the cold, and I realized how lucky I was to have a sister who refused to let me disappear into my sadness. On Christmas Eve, Olivia arrived home, cheeks red from the cold, arms full of presents. We made cocoa, lit candles, and put on the old holiday records Richard had loved. For a while, it was just the two of us in the glow of the tree, sharing stories and quiet moments. She asked about David, teasing me about the way I smiled when his name came up. I blushed, and she grinned, delighted to see her mother flustered by something so ordinary. That night, after Olivia went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, the house silent except for the hum of the furnace and the distant ticking of the clock. I thought about the years behind me, the joy, the betrayal, the sorrow and healing. I thought about Margaret in Italy, sending postcards from Naples and Rome, each one a small declaration of her new freedom. I thought about Nina, about Carol, about all the women I'd met in the grief group who were slowly, stubbornly, rebuilding their lives. And I thought about Richard, too. Not the man who'd lied, but the man who'd loved me as best he could. I forgave him again in that quiet hour, knowing I'd probably have to do it 1,000 more times before the hurt was truly gone. The next morning, the world was bright and cold. Olivia and I made pancakes, played Christmas music, and let ourselves be silly. We opened gifts, small, thoughtful things, mostly handmade. When we finished, I handed her a box I'd wrapped with extra care. Inside was the blue notebook and my letter to Richard. She read them slowly, eyes shining, then hugged me tighter than she had since she was a child. Thank you, Mom, for trusting me with this, for being honest. We spent the rest of the day together, walking through the snowy park, stopping for coffee at the cafe, where Margaret and I had first met as adversaries. I told Olivia the whole story, not sparing the painful parts. She listened, sometimes angry, sometimes sad, but mostly with the quiet strength I'd come to admire so much in her. That evening, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. I realized that the story I'd been telling myself for so long, the story of being deceived, abandoned, left adrift, was only part of the truth. The rest was this. I had survived. I had chosen to forgive, to open my heart again, to find joy where I could. That was my story now. As winter deepened, David and I settled into a gentle rhythm. We cooked meals together, read books side by side, walked through the snowy woods. There was no grand passion, no desperate need, just comfort and care and the quiet miracle of being understood. Nina's pottery had improved, though she still laughed at her wobbly bowls. Margaret sent a photo of herself on a Vespa, hair wild, eyes alive. Carol dragged me to a yoga class, where we collapsed in giggles before the second pose. My world, once small and frightened, had grown wide again, full of new faces and places, laughter and possibility. One evening, as I looked through old photographs, I came across the picture of Richard as a boy, the one I'd found in the safe deposit box. I turned it over in my hands, tracing the hopeful smile, the untamed hair. I wondered what he would think if he saw me now, if he would recognize the woman I'd become. I hoped he would be proud. But more than that, I hoped he would understand that I hadn't stopped loving him. I had just learned to love myself more. As the snow fell outside, softening the world, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. I no longer needed all the answers. The story of my life wasn't finished. It was simply unwritten, waiting for me to take the next step, one day at a time. As the new year unfolded, the world outside sparkled with frost, each morning a fresh start in silver and blue. I found myself waking before dawn, padding softly through the house, grateful for the hush and the chance to watch sunlight creep across the kitchen tiles. I was growing into my solitude, learning to savor the spaces that had once felt so hollow. There was a steadiness to my days now, a rhythm of small, ordinary joys that didn't depend on anyone else. Olivia flourished in New York, her calls still regular, but now edged with excitement and the bright strain of independence. I missed her, of course. I missed the clatter of her shoes in the hallway, the late-night confessions over bowls of ice cream. But I was proud, fiercely so, and I told her every chance I got. David became a gentle, steady presence. We were never in a hurry. Sometimes we'd meet for coffee, sometimes for a movie, sometimes just to walk in silence and watch the geese gather at the pond. There was a comfort in the simplicity, the lack of expectation. We both understood what it meant to lose and to choose again, and that understanding made everything easier. One evening, after dinner, David lingered by the door, hesitating in that careful way of his. "Elaine," he said quietly, "you know you don't owe me anything. We can go slow. I just want to be here, however you need." I smiled, touched by his kindness. "I know," I told him, meaning it. "That's what I need most of all." As winter melted into early spring, the days grew longer, the air tinged with hope. Crocuses pushed through the thawing ground, stubborn and bright. I started walking in the park again, sometimes with Nina, sometimes alone, breathing in the scent of mud and new grass. There was a kind of poetry to this slow awakening, a lesson in patience and faith. Margaret's postcards kept arriving, each one more exuberant than the last. "I'm learning Italian from a retired opera singer," she wrote. "Turns out I'm terrible, but he says my accent is passionate." Another card showed her posing on the steps of a Venetian church, laughing with a group of strangers. Her joy was infectious, and sometimes I caught myself daydreaming about buying a plane ticket just to see what it would be like to live so boldly. One Saturday, I hosted the book club at my house. The women filled the rooms with chatter and warmth, their laughter rolling through the halls like a blessing. We argued about the plot of the novel, drank too much wine, and shared stories that had nothing to do with husbands or loss. I realized, as the evening faded into candlelight, that I belonged here, not as a widow or a woman betrayed, but as myself. My own story, finally. After the others left, Nina stayed behind to help clean up. As we rinsed wine glasses at the sink, she turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Elaine, you've changed. There's a peace about you now. I'm glad you let yourself find it." I thought about that as I climbed into bed, tired but content. I realized I was no longer waiting for the pain to subside, or for the next blow to fall. I was simply living, present in my own skin, grateful for what I had. One afternoon, I decided to visit Annette, Richard's adoptive mother. I hadn't seen her since the autumn, and I felt a tug of obligation, and, I realized, affection. She greeted me at the door, her arms frailer but her spirit undiminished. We sat together in her sunlit living room, sipping tea and sharing quiet. She asked about Olivia, about my new routines. Eventually, the conversation turned, as it always did, to Richard. "He was so restless," she said, voice soft, eyes fixed on the window. "Always looking for the next thing, never quite satisfied. But he loved you, Elaine. I know he did, even if he couldn't always show it the way you deserved." I squeezed her hand, feeling tears prick my eyes. "Thank you for saying that. I needed to hear it." She nodded, her gaze gentle. "He wasn't always easy to love, but neither am I sometimes. We do our best with what we have." When I left her house, the air was sweet with the promise of rain, and I felt lighter, as if some old burden had finally been set down. As the weeks passed, David and I grew closer in small, comfortable ways. We attended a concert together, spent a Saturday morning at the farmer's market, exchanged recipes and jokes. I told him about my fears, of being hurt, of trusting again, of what it meant to let someone new into the spaces Richard had once filled. He listened, patient as ever. "It's okay to be scared," he said one evening as we sat watching the sun set behind the trees. "I am too. But we're not the same people we were before. We've learned how to hold on and how to let go." Sometimes, late at night, I still dreamed of Richard, sometimes angry, sometimes lost. But in the mornings, the dreams faded, replaced by the steady comfort of a life rebuilt. Olivia called more often as graduation approached. She was nervous, full of questions about jobs and apartments and what came next. I tried to reassure her, but I knew she had to find her own way, just as I had. One weekend, she came home for a visit, her arms full of laundry and takeout. We spent hours talking, about everything and nothing. She asked about David, about my friends, about the choices I'd made. For the first time, she seemed to see me not just as her mother, but as a woman with her own story. Before she left, she hugged me tight, whispering, "I love you, Mom. I'm glad you're happy." After she drove away, I stood on the porch, watching the clouds drift by. I realized I was happy, not in the way I once imagined, but in a deeper, quieter way. I was content with the unknown, with the unfinished edges of my life. One evening, Margaret called from Rome, her voice echoing with laughter and distant music. "I met someone," she said, breathless with excitement. "He's infuriating and brilliant and makes the best espresso I've ever tasted. I just wanted you to know, I'm letting myself love again." I congratulated her, my heart swelling with joy and hope. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the dark, thinking about all the ways we women survive, all the ways we choose to love, even after everything. I realized, with a kind of quiet awe, that none of us were really starting over. We were simply continuing, unwritten, but not unfinished. The world outside my window was blooming again, the air alive with birdsong and promise. I closed my eyes and let it fill me, ready for whatever came next. Spring arrived in a rush of green, the world suddenly shimmering with possibility. Each day brought some small delight, a cluster of daffodils erupting beside the porch, the robin building her nest beneath the eaves, the scent of fresh earth drifting in through open windows. I found myself lingering outside in the evenings, letting the cool air brush against my skin, feeling both new and ancient at once. My life was no longer measured in the gaps Richard left behind. The ache, when it came, was softer now, an old scar, not a fresh wound. I'd stopped counting what I'd lost and started noticing all that had grown in its place. Friendships that surprised me with their depth, mornings unhurried, the luxury of my own company. I was learning, slowly, that endings could become beginnings if you let them. David and I settled into a rhythm that felt effortless. Sometimes we'd cook together, experimenting with recipes and laughing at our failures. Sometimes we'd spend whole afternoons reading in companionable silence, feet touching beneath the coffee table. He never tried to fix my sadness when it surfaced. He simply let it be, holding my hand until the moment passed. That, more than anything, made me trust him. Olivia's graduation day bloomed warm and bright. I sat in the crowd, surrounded by proud parents and hopeful faces, my heart swelling with pride as she crossed the stage. She waved, grinning, her eyes searching the audience until they found mine. In that moment, I thought of all the times I'd doubted myself as a mother, all the sleepless nights spent worrying if I was enough. Watching her throw her cap in the air, I knew I'd done something right. Afterward, we celebrated at a small restaurant, just the two of us. She told me about job offers, apartments, the excitement and fear of stepping into the unknown. When she looked at me, her eyes were steady. "Thank you for showing me how to keep going, even when it's hard, for not pretending to be perfect." I reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You taught me too, more than you know." Back at home, I packed away the last of Richard's things I'd been holding onto. The tie he wore on our wedding day, a stack of old birthday cards, the watch with someone else's initials. I realized I no longer needed them to remember him. His memory lived in the shape of our daughter's smile, in the lessons I'd learned, in the woman I'd become. Margaret sent one final postcard from Italy, this one a photo of her with a man whose arm was slung casually over her shoulders, both of them sun-kissed and laughing. "I never thought I'd find peace again," she wrote. "But here it is, messy and beautiful and utterly mine. Thank you for being part of my story." I pinned the card to my fridge, a quiet reminder that healing wasn't just possible, but inevitable if you kept moving forward. One afternoon, as I walked through the farmer's market, Nina caught up with me, her arms full of tulips. We wandered the stalls, breathing in the scents of basil and strawberries, talking about nothing in particular. I realized how easy it felt to be with her, how friendships could become a kind of home. That evening, I hosted a small dinner. Just Nina, Carol, David, and a couple of neighbors who'd become friends. The conversation was lively, the food imperfect but abundant, the laughter easy. At one point, I caught myself looking around the table, struck by the simple miracle of belonging. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I was enough, just as I was. After everyone left, I stood at the sink, hands in soapy water, watching the night settle outside. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the clock. I thought of Richard, of Margaret, of the ways our lives had twisted together and apart. I thought of Olivia, ready to set out into her own adventure. I thought of myself, bruised but unbroken, still learning, still open. I dried my hands and stepped out onto the porch. The garden was full of new growth, the tulip I'd planted last year taller than ever, its petals catching the moonlight. I breathed in, feeling the air expand in my lungs, feeling whole. For so long, I'd believed that my story ended the day I learned the truth about Richard. But as I stood there, surrounded by the quiet pulse of my own life, I understood. The truth didn't end me. It set me free. I am not the woman Richard left behind, nor the one who lived in the shadow of his secrets. I am a woman unwritten, my story still unfolding, page after page. I am not afraid of what comes next. I am ready for it. And that, I realized as the night breeze stirred the garden, is more than enough. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Subscribe if this story finds you, and tell me, where in the world are you watching from?